The push to lift sanctions on Syria is gaining momentum. The new administration is engaged in a major diplomatic outreach, and top European and Arab diplomats have discussed the issue in Riyadh. So will the West be prepared to lift the restrictions and help rebuild Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Niamh Barker. The United Nations says 7 out of 10 Syrians require humanitarian assistance after 13 years of civil war. And a huge $500 billion is estimated to be needed to rebuild their country. Syria's new administration has engaged in a flurry of diplomatic activity in the past 2 weeks to convince the international community to rapidly lift sanctions imposed during the rule of Bashar al-Assad. And on Sunday, European and Arab foreign ministers met in Riyadh to discuss the country's future. But there are obstacles to overcome. While Western powers have begun rolling out some aid, they want to see progress towards inclusive and democratic governance. Concerns are growing. The euphoria following the fall of Assad may give way to frustration and violence if the process is delayed. Will the West be prepared to lift sanctions and fast? And can Syria's new rulers make the changes needed to win the confidence of world powers? We'll discuss these issues with our experts in just a moment's time. But first, this report by Victoria Gatenby.
More than a decade of fighting has ravaged cities and towns across Syria. International sanctions have further degraded its infrastructure and starved it of investment. Major international help from foreign powers is needed to rebuild the broken country. During talks in the Saudi capital Riyadh, the new Syrian administration called for sanctions to be lifted, a message echoed by Saudi Arabia.
I stress the importance of lifting unilateral and international sanctions imposed on Syria, as their continuation hinders the aspirations of the Syrian people to achieve development and reconstruction.
The US and the European Union imposed sanctions on Syria after the regime of Bashar al-Assad cracked down on anti-government protesters in 2011. The sanctions have made it difficult for Syria to import or export basic goods, forcing up prices. The EU said it will convene a meeting later this month in Brussels to discuss whether to lift them.
If we see the developments going to the right direction, we are ready to do the next steps, but also it has to have a fallback position. If we see that it's not going to the right direction, then we can also move back on this.
Germany, the EU's biggest economy, says it wants some of the sanctions to remain in place.
Sanctions against Assad's henchmen, who committed serious crimes during the civil war, must remain in place. But Germany proposes to take a smart approach to sanctions, providing repeat relief for the Syrian population.
Missing from the meeting in Riyadh were Iran and Russia, both staunch allies of the ousted Assad government, who helped it bypass sanctions by providing vital supplies. But Syria's political landscape has changed dramatically in little more than a month. Those who've suffered a weak economy and crippling sanctions for years say they're ready to rebuild their lives and the country's infrastructure. There's a huge task ahead, and Syria's new leadership will need to win the confidence and support of the international community to make it happen. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in all of our guests in Damascus. Amar Kaf is the Executive Director of the Omran Center for Strategic Studies and focuses on economic development and local government. In Gaziantep, Hind Kabawat is a professor on conflict resolution at George Mason University. She's also the former deputy head of the UN Syrian Negotiation Commission and took part in all the Geneva peace talks on Syria. And in Montpellier, France, Fadi Dayoub is the Executive Director of Local Development and Small Project Support. That's a Syrian NGO working on supporting accountable governance in Syria. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Welcome to Inside Story. Amma, I wonder if I can start with you. Of course, the US, EU and some Arab nations began imposing sanctions on Syria after Assad's brutal crackdown on opposition back in 2011. Of course, we all know that spiraled into a long and bloody conflict. But there are also sanctions on the group that ousted Assad as well, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS as we know them, because of the group's past links to al-Qaeda. Amma, when we talk of lifting sanctions, what specifically are we talking about?
Well, I think some of the sanctions that have been imposed on the state of Syria since the 70s, and then the Accountability Act in 2005, and then following the uprising in 2011, a third wave of sanctions. I think we talk about a lot of the sanctions that are sectoral sanctions that are imposed on the people, mainly on sectors such as technology, laptops, software, applications, and so forth, that have hindered the resilience of the Syrian population. I think those are the sanctions that have labeled Syria's state as a state of terror, as one that is complicit in the assassination of President Rafiq Hariri, and so forth. I think a lot of those sanctions need to be lifted immediately with no strings attached. Sectoral sanctions hinder the recovery of the average individual. We're talking about technology on electric grids, especially on electricity. This should not be limited to 6 months or should not be attached to any conditions. Sanctions that are imposed on specifically HTS, those might need some process, a mechanism that ensures their complete disassociation from their past. But I think we need to differentiate between sanctions that impact Syria's economic recovery. You want to allow Syria's diaspora to invest in Syria, to come back and invest in the production sector. I visited many of the manufacturing plants that are suffering from an inability to fix machines due to the sanctions imposed on spare parts. You talk about the airports, transportation, telecommunication. Those are very essential sectors for Syria to recover. If you want more participation and you want Syria's population to rise up and to be included, they first need to be empowered. And so empowering people with jobs, with production, with the ability to access the outside world, I think this goes to the grassroots of the Syrian population to be able to participate and to push for their role in the future. Now, other types of sanctions on individuals, actually those we need to be tightened. Okay. They need to be held accountable regardless of which country they right. Run into. And then the third sanctions are, of course, on HTS. Those require a mechanism to proceed forward.
OK, Amma, many thanks for laying the groundwork for us. Turning to you, Hind, I mean, Saudi Arabia and others have called for this urgent lifting of sanctions, haven't they? I mean, Saudi's Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, said, quote, continuing them will hinder the aspirations of the brotherly Syrian people to achieve development and reconstruction. Ammar has just underlined a lot of those points. Hind, you're Syrian. You've been able to visit Syria for the first time in many years. How much of an obstacle do you see existing sanctions when it comes to the rebuilding of this new Syria?
First, thank you for the invitations. I just returned back from Damascus. The most important things now to lift the sanction, because it's very crucial to support the Syrian people during this transitional time. It's very important for them because this time economically it's very challenging and the Syrian people are struggling to meet their basics, daily needs. There is no, Assad, of course, left the country ruined and bankrupt. So the people, there is no electricity, there is no salaries, there is a humanitarian aid. They need a humanitarian aid. There is a need for everything. So lifting the sanction could send also a positive message. And I just want to thank all the countries who are supporting this, because it is sending a message for the Syrian people who have experienced hardship in the recent years, that they are not alone in this struggle. So additionally, I passed by the bank 3 days ago. There's a big line up of old people who are trying to get their retirement salary, and there is no money in the bank. So we need to take care of the people. The electricity, 1 hour a day, it is very hard for the Syrian people. So this action would also allow companies to repair and distribute the electricity more effectively for the benefit of the Syrian people. We're here working, and we want to work for the Syrian people. They are our priority. For us, their priority is number one.
Right.
And we need also the most important things. We want the refugee. We are not a refugee community. Every single person I met in the refugee or the IDP camp, they have one hope. They want to go back to their home. I've been driving in the suburb of Damascus, everywhere, Douma, they're all destroyed. How do these refugees and IDP camp and IDP can go back to their homes? So we need
questions, Hind. I hope we will cover over the course of this discussion. But turning to you, Fadi, we've heard obviously from Amar and Hind there, both explaining in passionate urgency why the sanctions need to be lifted in their views. Why then are these obstacles still at the forefront of the minds of politicians in Europe and the United States? What is the biggest stumbling block so far when it comes to simply lifting these sanctions immediately?
Well, I think the pretext for maintaining the sanctions is that they want to see things happening on the ground before they decide on lifting the sanctions. And I do agree with Amar that we should not mix all the types of sanctions in one pot. The sanctions that need to be lifted very urgently are the sanctions on the Syrian state and the Syrian institutions, because these are required for the country to be able to survive for the coming period. We are going to go into a very tough transition period, and it requires the participation of everyone. But nobody will be participating if they are struggling just to survive. So if we are really sincere, if these countries are sincere on helping the transition moving forward in a democratic way, they have to be enablers and not obstacles to this transition. Currently, sanctions against the Syrian state and the Syrian institution are obstacles to this kind of transition. Besides, the design of the sanctions was to serve a certain political objective that was related to the outgoing regime. Now the regime has changed, so there is no, I would say, even legally basis.
Understood. So the objective, just to repeat, Fadi, so the objective, the original objective of the sanctions is now obsolete. Now that the playing field has essentially been completely changed and rewritten. Turning to you, Amar, Fadi raised an interesting point. Presumably, as I understand, the Germans have requested sanctions on Assad himself, and those who committed serious crimes under the old regime would indeed remain. If that is the case, I mean, how easy is it to separate these sanctions, to uncouple them from each other? I mean, how complex a process would that be, Amar?
I mean, it is a complex process. However, if you start from the human-centric approach, then you'll be able to dissect through it and differentiate. Sanctions on the Assad regime remain, but the state is different now. The Assad regime is gone. It has fled away, and so it is unfair to continue, imposing those sanctions on a new regime that has nothing to do with the Assad regime. Now, I mean, especially sanctions. I mean, look at, I visited a child birth hospital, Muassa Hospital and others. They have no MRI machines. They are specifically listed on sanctions as being used by the Assad regime in the past as a place to torture people. And so, but this is a new era. And so hospitals need to have a specific exemption, not unlimited, not attached to political strings. Those sectors, the health sector, the education sector. I also visited Damascus University. It is so sad to see a great university such as Damascus University struggling to provide heating to its exam halls or medical equipment for its students, the ability to study, as many of the doctors have been now in Germany, in the US, in many European countries, Sweden, and so forth, are one of the brightest doctors in those countries. And yet they come back and they want to give, those same Syrian doctors want to give back to Syria. But then the obstacles are those sanctions imposed on medical equipment. And sometimes not only the equipment it could be exempt, but then the software and the maintenance and the electricity that supports to it, you know, it's all linked to each other. And so when we start from a human-centric approach, another problem, of course, is the over-compliance of sanctions, and that's why we need a full exemption for all of those essential services: electricity, health, education, and the food livelihood, and then to allow Syrians in the diaspora to invest in producing sectors. Syria was a producing economy, was a self-sufficient, and I think there's a great chance without international support, Syrians can rebuild their country.
Understood, Ammar. Well, let's talk about the human-centric approach and international support, because we know, of course, that at the summit in Riyadh, the EU's foreign policy and security chief, Kaja Kallas, was there. There have been some positive sounds coming from Europe. The Italians are the most recent to say that there should be an immediate moratorium on sanctions. Fadi, on January the 27th, EU foreign ministers will meet to decide what to do next when it comes to sanctions. They are somewhat hamstrung by the process that the EU demands, which is there has to be a complete consensus across the bloc. Do you anticipate any breakthrough in Brussels, Fadi?
Well, I surely hope so. Especially the European sanctions. The European sanctions are much more related. I mean, there are recent sanctions that are much more related to the uprising, to the revolution, and to the repression that the regime actually had against the revolution. Now the regime is gone, and these sanctions were were actually designed to be in a way to help the interest and the aspirations of the Syrian people. Now the interest and Syrian people's aspirations now are towards removing the sanctions. So if they are truthful to what the intention of the sanctions was, then they have to think about removing them. Again, I'm talking about the sanctions related to the Syrian state and Syrian institutions. All the people that were involved in killing Syrians or committing violations to human rights, these should be kept, in my opinion. But the ones that are actually affecting the capability of the Syrians to survive for the time being and to start recovering and rebuilding, these should be lifted immediately, knowing also that actually lifting sanctions is just not a button that you actually apply now and then the following day they are off. The actually extraction of the sanction regimes from the overall compliance of the world, especially in the financial system, is something that takes time. So the sooner we get to this, the better would actually be for the Syrians. The sooner we'll get the effects of the sanctions out. Removing the sanctions would not remove the effects of the sanctions before several months, in sometimes even several years. So we better start very early. And in my opinion, not only removing sanctions, now we have to move to incentivizing. We have to have a reverse system. If really these countries want to help the Syrian people now and then in the future in the transition towards a democratic and an inclusive country, then they now should not only remove the sanctions, but start thinking about incentivizing measures that would help actually counter-affecting the effects of the sanctions that would take time to be taken out of the system.
Understood. There has to be underlying incentives. Turning to you and the sanctions that still currently are placed upon HTS as an organisation, the EU leaders have spoken of the need for, quote, tangible progress in a political transition that reflects Syria in all its diversity. That is the view coming out of the European Union. Hind, I understand you are a Syrian Christian. What does tangible progress mean to you as a minority?
I'm Syrian first, proud to be Syrian first. And I just want to make sure that the important for Syria to have sustainability. And lifting the sanction can also give the incentive for the government to have more inclusive government. The more inclusive government means that we have to have more political party, everybody from Syria, from every ethnic and religion group. They need to be the real diversity who reflect the real fabrics of the Syrian people. We are a very diverse society, and we have and we need to be everyone to be part of the government. So we need to have the inclusive government. And I think this lifting the sanction can give a motivation and give incentive for the new government to be more inclusive. We're supposed to have it in March, so we're going to work very hard until March to push for this, because without this, we cannot have sustainable Syria. We need to have everyone at the table and contributing to the build of their country.
Right, all three of you are pretty much saying the same thing when it comes to a sense of urgency when it comes to lifting sanctions. However, that doesn't appear to be the attitude of the United States and indeed the European Union. They be prepared to be taking their time. They want to see evidence. They want to see proof. For our viewers and our podcast listeners, I mean, let's recap what we've seen so far in terms of the lifting of these measures. The US eased some restrictions. The US Treasury issued a general license for 6 months that authorises certain transactions, namely energy sales. It follows, of course, the decision to drop the $10 million bounty on the leader of HTS, Ahmed al-Sharaa. I mean, the Americans appear, Ammar, to be advocating that very gradual approach. If we're talking about months, even potentially years, I mean, can Syria really wait that long, Ammar?
I don't think so. I mean, the Syrian American community have launched actually a campaign to end those types of sanctions that touch people's lives. So 13 Syrian American organizations have launched a campaign to end those sanctions, have launched also a lobbying effort in DC. There's a conference in February in Washington by a lot of Syrian American organizations to call for a much faster approach to, again, differentiate between sanctions on individuals that committed human rights, sanctions on HTS, and then sanctions on state institutions and public sector, as well as private investments. I mean, it is vital for Syrians to be able to empower SMEs and local producing sectors that create jobs and allow this country not to explode. I mean, if there are no salaries for another month, things could escalate. There's a lot of issues in terms of tensions, community tensions and so forth that require an injection of funds by the international community, but also by Syrian diasporas and refugees to come back and invest in this recovery.
Right. Fadi, turning to you, because there are also some local considerations, particularly from countries like Germany, where there has been a large number of Syrian asylum seekers and refugees based there, invited, of course, by the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. But it has undoubtedly been linked to the rise of the far right. We've got an election coming up at the end of February in Germany. Germany clearly wants to make sure that Syria is a safe place for refugees to potentially return to. They also don't want to see German taxpayers' money funding a potentially questionable leadership if HTS turns out to be something other than it apparently appears to be. I mean, it's not as simple as just lifting sanctions right now. Is that a concern for Syrians, that these calculations are happening behind the scenes in so many countries?
It is, actually. And to be honest with you, we've suffered enough now to be paying the price for internal politics of any other country. So we want now to move forward. And there is a difference between the taxpayers' money of Germany, which comes through the form of assistance, and the sanctions, because this is not German taxpayer money. What we're asking for is the right, for example, for the Syrians that are in diaspora to send money to their relatives so actually they can help, but easily. We've been suffering. We actually, even before the fall of the regime, everybody was talking about the overcompliance. Now there is an opportunity not to talk about overcompliance, but to delete the source of the problem itself that actually resulted in overcompliance. Again, it's not a chèque blanc. It's not something that actually would go and do whatever you want. No, but we are asking for redesigning these sanctions, keeping the ones that are related to the regime, redesigning the ones that are related to HTS, removing everything that is related to Syria as a state or institutions, and be ready. Now, those who put sanctions, they actually invented them and designed them to respond to a political objective. Now, if there is a new political objective that comes because there is not enough inclusivity, etc., then we can discuss putting sanctions back again. But now, preemptively, suppose that this is not going to go well, and then we keep sanctions as a kind of stick. This stick is hurting so many people that I don't think it's the right approach. The right approach is to show signs of helping the people and be ready then to readjust if needed, but not take the position on prove yourself first and take. It's the Syrians that are suffering. So what we have to say is, here you go, and then if you prove not to be right, then we can take measures.
Right, okay.
The sanctions were put on the regime of the Assad regime few months and years after the repression has started.
Fadi, we're just approaching the end. We're just approaching the end of our discussion. I want to speak to Hind finally, if I can, because what Fadi has very clearly underlined, Hind, is that there needs to be a certain degree of strategy when it comes to what sanctions potentially remain, what sanctions need to be lifted, the kind of punitive or restrictive measures that may well need to be in place to ensure that there is trust built within the international community. Your final thoughts as we reach the end of this programme. How should the international community approach this incredibly complex challenge?
Very easy. We have a goal, and we need to serve the Syrian people. Remove all the sanction on the state and the government and the institutions, so that people can live. The Syrian people can live in dignity. We want the refugee to come back. We need them to have their homes, and we need to have for them a proper life. It is an act of empathy that can help stabilizing the economy and encourage the Syrian people to live better. So it's very easy. The regime sanction will stay, and then remove all the sanction on the institution, because we want our people to live in dignity finally after all those years of struggle. And then we need to think about also everybody is complaining. This government is still only 1 month. They're trying their best. We need to give them some chance to show that they're doing a good job. Because in the end of the day, we want our Syria and the Syrian people to live in a better than what they did in the last 15.
All right, Hind, many thanks for your final thoughts there. As you said, perhaps Syria needs right now is a lot of international empathy. Your words there, Hind. Many thanks for that. Hind Kabawat, Fadi Dayoub and Amer Khalaf. A pleasure to have all three of you on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Niamh Barker, and the whole team here, bye for now.